Hi friends, welcome. Today I want to talk about the Hillsong documentary series that Discovery put out. I want to share my thoughts. Very quickly, I want to share my background with Hillsong, and that is one that is extensive but from afar. So I've never actually been to like a Hillsong campus or gone to a Hillsong college, if there's more than one. I have primarily interacted with Hillsong from a musical standpoint from afar. I've played their music on stage, at churches, and I've been to a Hillsong concert. And I think generally from a musical standpoint, they tend to stay in a really good realm from a theological standpoint, everything they're trying to accomplish. I tend to be on board with what they're up to. Not to say it's perfect, nothing's perfect, and that's going to be a theme throughout everything we talk about today. Haven't spent a whole lot of time interacting with their teaching, but when I have, it tends to be very encouraging. It doesn't seem to be overly in incorrect realms of theology, but I haven't spent a lot of time, studying it, so I will leave that there. I want to talk about each episode of this documentary series. I'm gonna go through my notes that I took as I was watching this thing, and they're very stream of consciousness, very potentially scattered. I do apologize, but I figured this would be a good way to go about it. And I've tried to bold out all the things that are important to mention. So, first, episode 1. There's 3 episodes. Episode 1. I don't know how many numbers I just held up then, but anyway, episode 1. First off, they just tried to establish what Hillsong was from their perspective as the people who are making this documentary. And they broke down that, it feels this church is very big and they have a lot of reach and influence. That will be another very important theme for them throughout all of this. And they mention, it's a rock show, and that characterization is always annoying to me because I don't think it quite makes sense of what is happening in a church setting when there's a lot of production happening. I don't think generally churches are actually trying to be rock shows. I think it might feel that way in a lot of ways. I'm not saying that no church has ever said, let's be a rock show today. But I think that's a bit inaccurate and kind of a wacky way to describe it. But I had a feeling at the very beginning of this thing that they were going to end up portraying Hillsong as a cult at some point. And there are a lot of their stops that these exposés like to hit when it comes to churches. And they hit like every one of them in this series. And I'm not saying, I'm not speaking to the truthfulness or not truthfulness of those stops. Other than, I wouldn't say that Hillsong is particularly a cult to start there. I don't think that that's a very good way to describe Hillsong Church. But anyway, I said that to say, I predicted it and it happened. Bingo. They definitely went that route, mixed in with other routes. So, but I would say primarily the documentary series was about Hillsong and church hurt. That's the thing. And that's one of the reasons why it's particularly interesting to me to talk about this. So what I'll say right from the beginning is if you're in a position where you are in a church and there's church hurt there is some, whatever type of abuse or poor behavior, whatever that looks like, do not follow the church. Follow Jesus. If you want to be a Christian, follow Jesus. Follow Jesus and his teachings. The church was never meant to be the thing that we follow. What a lot of people get into are situations that turn into bad situations because they were following the church too closely, and then the church hurt them, so they pulled out of the church. And they didn't seek out another church, right? They pulled back and they said, I'm done with church. And also, eventually, at least, I'm done with Jesus, right? And so that's where these things really go wrong. That's when the problems in churches are, they really come to their fullest potential of badness is when people separate from the church and separate from Jesus. So I think we have to be very intentional in churches about making sure that we're dealing with these issues that cause church hurts and church hurts, and taking care of them when they happen and trying to avoid it as much as possible. I think to some degree you can't avoid the way that people are going to perceive certain things, but there's certainly a right and a wrong, and there's a lot of right in churches, but there's a lot of wrong in churches as well. So one of the things that they spoke about, I should say one of the things that they didn't speak about a lot is sharing the gospel. And what I mean by that is throughout all of these episodes, I didn't see a whole lot of talk about Hillsong's desire to share the gospel. And what I can say in my interactions with Hillsong is that that's extremely important to them, that they share the gospel with people. But the documentary sort of twisted things into making it seem like it was about money and power and manipulation, growing, like taking over. They over and over they showed this map of how Hillsong is spread through the world, and it seemed like we were watching like the Soviet Union spreading across. Like that was the idea that they were. It was the implication that I was receiving from it, and I found that to be very interesting. And I was starting to get the sense that maybe they really had a problem with Hillsong being a church that expands. And it made me feel like maybe they're not okay with churches really having that much expansion and power overall. I don't know, but that's just gave me weird vibes. But they didn't mention the whole point that churches generally expand, and that's to share the gospel. Go and make disciples of all the nations. It's an expansion type of thing. And so if you're not a Christian, you may not enjoy that, but that's what we do as Christians. That's what we're after. So I thought that it was very interesting that was very much downplayed. There was a couple of times where they mentioned it, and particularly I think it was when they had Christian voices on, people who are, and I appreciate that they did that, but because I was wondering how much of that they were going to have. So they had Christian voices sprinkled in, people who you could listen to them and go, okay, they're still probably part of a church somewhere. They seem to be biblically thinking about things, I should say. And I appreciated that they had that. Now, what I noticed that they didn't have a lot of, which was unfortunate, was they didn't have a lot of Hillsong really defending themselves. And when I say that, I don't mean like they have, Joel Houston like doing an interview with him. I mean, Hillsong has put out a lot of content online talking about what their goals are. They only use snippets of that, and it was in the service of getting a certain point across, which is weirdly what can happen when pastors decide to open the Bible and just preach on a topic and take verses out of context. It kind of feels like the same thing that they were doing there, and I think it was problematic. I think that they should have used more of what Hillsong is saying their perspective is on why they're expanding and everything they're trying to do. I wish there was more of that, because I really felt like I got one side in a lot of ways. And even the Christian voices were fairly skeptical of Hillsong. And that's fine skepticism. I'm being skeptical right now. I'm not here to defend Hillsong in any way that shouldn't be defended. But, and I understand it's a bit of a nonsense statement, there are things that I don't like about what Hillsong has done. And then there are things where I think maybe they went a little bit overboard in the characterizations. So anyway, not much talk about the gospel and the fact that they're trying to share the gospel. There was a lot of talk about marketing and expansion and money and power. But that they failed to include that, at least from, unless Hillsong is truly about all of these, selfish motives and money and power, which I highly doubt. I highly doubt that's their mission. Everything I've ever seen from Hillsong Church doesn't seem like that's their mission. It seems like they have operated in some ways poorly, perhaps, but it seems like their mission's pretty clear. And everything about what they're trying to do seems to be about that. Now, the leaders up top, they could be addicted to power and money. But I don't see the evidence, and I'm not saying there's not this evidence, but I don't see the evidence to really make that accusation well, and I didn't see the documentary really put forth a whole lot of evidence around this. So I'm happy to, present me with something that I'm not emphasizing enough. What I see is that Hillsong is a church that has always been trying to share the gospel, and they've always been trying to expand from that perspective. And to leave that out, I think, is unfortunate. So I did mention, they had some Christian voices in there, which I think was helpful. One of the things they mentioned about the 30-minute mark of episode 1 is that churches should be transparent about their money. And I think that's exactly right. I think that a lot of these problems we see come from a lack of transparency and accountability. And when churches go sideways, a lot of times those two things are involved: lack of transparency, lack of accountability. So we need sort of checks and balances, people in the right places of leadership type of system to keep people, especially pastors who are in these giant churches who have a ton of influence. Power is very seductive, of course. We need people breathing down their necks to make sure that they're staying where they need to be as pastors. And one of the things that they mention in there is that as a species, we're not good with power. And I think that's, either they mentioned that or I took that note. But I think that's a good point nonetheless. And but when watching a documentary, like I said, check the perspective of the documentary and test to see if or test in your mind to see if they are using both sides of the argument well, if they're interacting with both sides of the argument thoughtfully and presenting both sides. Because the best documentaries often leave you feeling like, I can see that side, that makes some sense. I can see that side, that makes some sense. I don't really know where to fall. If you're having a hard time making a decision about where you fall on something, a lot of times that means that you're watching a good documentary. It's giving you both sides of the argument well. And I felt like this one, it didn't do the worst job, but it didn't do the best job in the world. But when people are making these claims, there's a lot of anecdotal claims in the series. People are making these claims. Always test it with evidence. If you're going to, if it really matters to you that point, and you want to figure out where the person's coming from with that point, test it and go, okay, why do they feel this way? What was potentially happening? What could have been happening that maybe made them feel this way, but wasn't necessarily what was happening? Because, there was a lot of emphasis on, so there was one girl on the series, and she was sitting in this old-fashioned church, and they always do this where they put people in the old-fashioned church setting for their interviews. And she was sharing about, all the abuse and the manipulation. And I think she mentioned at one point this idea of, how they were getting free labor from her. If it wasn't her, it was other people. We'll get to that in just a second. But I was waiting for her throughout this whole series to actually explain what happened to make her feel that way. And I don't think she ever went into detail about what actually caused her to have these perceptions of Hillsong. She was a volunteer at one point, She was very hurt. They didn't really go into detail about that. And they went into more detail in other areas, but I left that part thinking, okay, why did you feel this way? And I need to understand this so that I can know where the church is doing something wrong and where you might be perceiving things incorrectly. And that is something that can happen. That is something that does happen. You can, if you spend time listening to people's experiences, you understand that people often twist in their mind what was actually going on, and they leave with a perception that was not what was going on. And so, little things like that throughout the documentary, I was like, okay, let's explore this. Why are we feeling this way? Why are we making this claim so free labor. This was one of the things that they mentioned a lot. I'm like jumping around episodes. hopefully we'll stay on this 3-episode template that I have laid out in my head, but we're jumping around at this point. It's just going to be what it is. They kept making this claim, church is getting free labor. And I was listening, I was like, so volunteering? So volunteering is a voluntary agreement with whoever you're volunteering for that you're going to volunteer for them. And it's going to be free labor. But the reason why you're doing this in a church setting is because you want to serve the body. You want to serve God. You want to serve people. It's not about the money. Churches can't pay everybody. Now, should churches pay certain people more? Or some when they're not paying them any? Sure. But that's like an in-house, people need to sort that out in-house within the church kind of thing. But people were really getting upset about this free labor thing. And that to me is quite bizarre. I mean, they didn't really define how Hillsong went beyond the realm of what they would say is reasonable volunteering. I'm going to drink my green tea. They didn't really move out of that realm into the realm of exploiting their free labor. Let's put it that way. They didn't really make a good case, at least in my opinion, on the fact that they were exploiting that. But that was a big claim that they made. And so there were things that they set up, but they didn't explore them enough for me to really get a good understanding. And that's how documentaries tend to work. You can't explore, it's not a legal deposition. You can't explore every corner of everything. I understand that. And it's fine that is that way. I think documentaries should be transparent about that. They should explain that perhaps, go explore this on your own, whatever that means. I don't know exactly how that works in editing, but they shouldn't be encouraging people just to take the documentary at its word when they haven't presented a really well-rounded case. So test it with evidence. When a documentary makes a claim, test it with evidence. Really dig into something if you care about it. One of the things that they mention in this whole setup of Hillsong, they were focusing a lot of attention on Hillsong, New York, the campus in New York City. And apparently, and this is what I'm talking about now, I have not tested this with evidence. I haven't spent the time to know if this is true or not. And I'm saying that I know I just said test it with evidence, but I have a lot of things to do. I'm not going to test everything with evidence all the time. And because of that, the position that I'm taking is that I don't know if this is true or not, but if it is, it's a little bit hilarious, but also extremely unfortunate and does not belong in the church. Apparently they had a VIP section in Hillsong, New York City, where the very important people came. And that's ridiculous if that's the case. That should never happen in a church. God has no favorites, right? The church should have no favorites. We should echo that. So that was insane. And one of the things that they kept leaning into was money and how, they're using money and how they're a multi-million-dollar corporation. They have all this money, and why do they have all this money? Then whenever people are exposing a church, they focus on money. And that's important. We do want to manage money well in the church and not do it in a way that is overindulgent, but is transparent. There's nothing wrong with a lot of money. The problem is the love of money, and that works for the individual and that works for the church. So if you see the love of money in a church, get out of that church and go find another church. But they seem to take issue with the fact that Hillsong had a marketing strategy, that they were operating like a business, and I see no reason for that to be a problem. Once again, if we're trying to share the gospel, marketing the gospel is part of sharing the gospel. So, the way that's done is important, but there's nothing wrong with marketing it. They made this claim in one of the episodes. I think it was the end of the first one, because I wrote it down as a note in the first one. Watch out for the girls, the gold, and the glory. And this is referring to pastors and how they interact with being a pastor, experiencing a bunch of power and money and growth. Watch out for the girls, the gold and the glory. I think all of that is, that's a beautiful statement, because that is what happens. That's what tends to happen when you have somebody who does not have the right character, the character as laid out biblically, and does not have accountability. They end up falling into one of these traps. And we see it over and over and over, and it's terrible. It's terrible. And when I say that, I'm thinking of people who have been in those situations where their pastor was falling into one of those traps. It's terrible. Okay, episode 2. Oh, also, at the end of episode 1, they say, the pastors didn't respond to requests for comments. But one of the things that I thought was once again kind of like what I was saying a second ago, they still had media online where they talk about what they're after as a church, what their goals are. And they didn't use a lot of that. It was for points. It was for specific points that they were after. I did mention a second ago that, in regards to taking things out of context, I'm not saying each time they mentioned that these, they played a clip of one of these pastors speaking, that they took them out of context. My point was that they only used snippets of it, potentially taking them out of context, to prove certain points. And they did not let the people speak for themselves in terms of their motives very well. When I'm specifically speaking to the pastors and leadership of Hillsong. Okay, episode 2. This entire episode, what are we at, 21 minutes? This entire episode was more or less about Carl Lentz's adventures. And he's not standing on solid ground at all. I think he did a lot of things wrong. And the church kicked him out, and that's good. But they spent a lot of time talking about how he focused on purity in his previous church and in Hillsong when he was preaching. He would spend a lot of time talking about purity. And of course, that makes him into a hypocrite now. But I think it's fine that they did that. I think it's important to point out hypocrisy, and there seems to be that. But they also spoke to the woman who he ended up having an affair with, and she shared her side of the story. Well, first off, I don't want to get into that just yet. One of the things there was a girl who used to go to his previous church, and she was talking about how she had a boyfriend, and her and the boyfriend were serving at the church, and they got into some sexual interaction with each other. And so Carl had an altar call at one point, and they went up for that altar call, and then they went into the back with Carl, and they spoke with him about their what happened, right? And they said that the idea was that he handled it incorrectly. And according to them, once again, anecdotal evidence, right? It's not valuable, but it is anecdotal. It's where they have one person sharing their perspective of what happened. You have to be very careful with that. Very careful. So apparently he asked them if they had used protection, and they said yes. And so he said, so it was premeditated. And then he said that they can't serve or see each other for 6 months after that. So that was, that whole situation was meant to be something in regards of his hypocrisy and his inaccurate handling of what happened. Now, I think part of what he seemingly did there was good. If he said, yeah, you can't serve, you can't serve, you can't serve right now because you've done something that is not fitting for somebody who is going to be a leader in the church in any capacity. I don't mean like pastor leader, I mean on a smaller scale leader. I think that's perfectly fair to say you can't serve right now. I think it's also, there's situations where maybe you say, okay, that happened a little while back and you guys seem like you're repentant of what you're doing, what happened. You understand that that's not what you should be doing as leaders in the church. So that's fine. You don't have to, I think both of those may work out. It all shakes out in like a personal meeting type of setting. But if his first response was, so it was premeditated, I don't know. I don't want to get into all the details of that. But anyway, that was making the claim of everything that he was up to now, and let's look back and then let's see what he was up to then, and whatever. Now I think for one, this was a long time ago. So just because he got himself into a squirrely situation doesn't mean that back then he wasn't necessarily in those squirrely situations. You could say, so you have to think all of this through very carefully. But there was that type of thing that they were focusing on, and then they moved out of that into talking about Hillsong College. And first off, we have his secondary lover. So she came on, explained that they met in a park, and it was like the first time they met, but she gave him her number. And it was a very odd story, I thought. And then they slowly got closer, and then he started going over to her place, and the rest is history. But near the end, one of the things she mentioned was it just happened. Like this whole thing just happened to her, and I saw a general lack of taking responsibility on her side of things. And he played a serious role in this, but she also played a serious role, and so we have to take responsibility in these things, all of us, everyone, and the leadership who could have done better at seeing and removing him quickly and whatever. That's all important as well. We all have to do our job, and we can't just leave. He should have been treated with the same. I was going to say not kid gloves. I have a kid gloves idea in my head. Adult gloves that he treated the other people who came into his office, apparently, and he said that they couldn't serve. So accountability. They went into Hillsong College, spent a lot of time around that. One of the things they mentioned was a sexual assault case between a girl named Anna. She went to a party, or went over to somebody's house, I should say, and they were hanging out together. I'm not sure party is the correct way to, I want to paint it in the most, charitable light. So she went over, hung out, and one of the guys who served at Hillsong was drunk, and he had a physical interaction with her. It was a big thing, and according to her and her father, Hillsong waited too long to act, and so there was issues around that. I don't want to get into the details of these sexual cases too much, because I just think they're too important to just kind of fly through flippantly. So if Hillsong waited too long to deal with this type of thing, once again, of course, terrible. There should be zero tolerance. But also, I think that the guy who committed this, he's not Hillsong Church. I think it's important to take note of this, because you get a big enough church and you're going to have unfortunate situations happen. That's just how it is. And the way the church handles it is when the church comes into play. But when a person independently does something sinful, it's not the church's fault. And you could get into what's the church teaching and all of this stuff, but it doesn't seem to me that Hillsong played a lot of a role in this, at least initially. And so they seem to sort of paint it as, okay, this is like a Hillsong culture thing. When, I don't know, if I saw 30 examples of this, then I'd maybe start to go, okay, what's going on at Hillsong? But it just didn't seem like it had much to do with the Hillsong church. It had more to do with this particular person who I literally wrote down, he was a drunk idiot. So that's, we'll leave that there. So, okay, let's move on to episode 3. Episode 3 also spent a lot of time on Hillsong College, but I think the overarching narrative was actually Brian Houston. So we're slowly just moving up the chain. We started off with like Hillsong as a whole, Hillsong New York, then we moved into Carl Lentz, now we're into Brian. So, of course, there's a major thing right now going on with Brian Houston and around previous sexual assault allegations about his father and how he didn't deal with it. He had understanding of it at some point and didn't deal with it as he should have. Like I said, not going to spend too much time on that. But they went into, a couple, there's another case where when this girl was joining Hillsong College, this is kind of getting into like how Hillsong's so focused on purity. She went to Hillsong College and they asked her about her background or like sexual background, and she said that she was sexually assaulted at one point, and she told them that, and they told, she felt very shameful for this, and they told her that she did a bad thing, but she's now forgiven. Like, this is all really hairy stuff, and it all depends on the details, how all of this was handled, right? It's not clean, cut, and dry. These are types of situations where if you're actually in the church and something like this happens, or something even on a smaller level, very small type of thing compared to some of the stuff we've been talking about, you're going to spend hours talking to a lot of different people trying to figure out what actually happened here. And you're going to get a lot of different stories. You're going to have to piece it all together. And it's going to be like a legal proceeding in a sense. And this was not that. So you can take certain things from documentaries. And the better they build out their case, the more you can take. But you do have to be careful. Apparently they asked people to sign an NDA when they joined. I don't really know why. That's very interesting to me. When they joined Hillsong College, I should say. I wrote down people don't like when churches operate like businesses. And that's something we've been seeing over and over. That they don't, they were talking about how they had LLCs. And I was like, okay, nonprofit status, I guess there's importance there, but it's really not. The question is, what is the church doing? Like, how are they? What are the things that they're doing in the world? Are they bad or good? Right? Are they operating like a biblical church should? So, let's see. What's next? Got into sexual abuse allegations. This was definitely the most serious of all of them, I would say. So I won't go into any of the details with what happened with his father. What I'll say is that when the community hurts people, when the church community hurts people, and when any community hurts people, it cuts very deep, causes all sorts of fallout. And whether it's sexual abuse or whether it's somebody being, verbally abused in some sort of, like, the youth pastor was really mean to all the students, like smaller things. This is something that is, all of these things are extremely important. There has to be accountability and transparency and all these things so that we can avoid this stuff happening in the first place, so that people aren't feeling this way to the best of our abilities. But sometimes they do happen. If they've happened to you, and I would say most Christians who have spent some time in the church, they've experienced some version of this. I have. People in my family have. It's very common because the church is imperfect. It's full of imperfect people. It's never going to be perfect. But the church is not the head of us. Jesus is the head of us. He calls us to be a part of the gathering. So we should not be a part of the gathering. This is where a lot of people go wrong, is they say, I'm done with the gathering, right? They won't even use that terminology because maybe they haven't even read that verse before that says, don't forsake the gathering. But they will leave the gathering. They'll say, I don't want any of that, church. It hurts me. I understand how hard it can be to find a church that operates correctly and that teaches the right things. I've been on the church hunt. I understand how it works. I've been in churches. I understand how it works. But if God tells me that I should I should always be pursuing being a part of the gathering, then I'm going to trust that he's going to sort all that out. Be a part of the gathering, and of course, what happens in the church has nothing to do with God's word and God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit. Has nothing to do with any of that stuff. So do separate those two in your head. People have a really hard time doing that, and that's the main message I want to get across. All of this stuff that happened, whatever is wrong and right, and whatever actually happened, Jesus is always the cornerstone. He's always the focus. And if you do that, no matter what happens at a church, I'm able to understand that if I go to a church and something ridiculous happens, I can go, okay, well, that was sinful behavior. We are sinners. That's how it is. I'm going to leave that there. I'm going to go away from that. I'm going to find a new home for myself. And the separation is incredibly important. But I think that's it for this one. Hopefully it was coherent. Thank you so much for watching. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I hope you have a lovely day. Goodbye.